England in the mid-15th century was not a land of romance, as the courtly poets sang, but of knives hidden behind smiles. It was a kingdom of iron and gold, iron forged into swords that divided families, and gold melted into crowns that weighed heavily on children's heads. The air itself was charged with suspicion. Behind every tapestry, behind every banquet, lurked the question of succession, inheritance, and survival. Kings did not sleep soundly, and queens rarely lived without whispers behind their backs. And into this world came her story. The girl was no one in particular when she first opened her eyes to the world, a daughter of nobility, yes, but one of dozens who mattered less for who they were than for what they could offer. A girl's value was never her laughter, her wit, her smile. It was her bloodline, her womb, and her ability to cement power in a world that consumed itself with dynastic wars. She was 12 when her fate was sealed. Picture the scene. A great hall lit by the flicker of tallow candles, the scent of roasted meat heavy in the air. Courtiers laughed, but their eyes were cold, studying alliances, calculating debts. Somewhere in that hall, men twice, thrice her age were already discussing her marriage. She was not present at the table. Children rarely were. But her life, her very body, was being divided like coin among them. For them, she was a prize to be traded. For her, though she did not yet know it, she was a lamb being led to slaughter. England was fractured then, a kingdom threatened by internal war. Nobles raised banners against the crown, armies trampled fields meant for harvest, families chose sides, and the throne itself seemed cursed, passed from weak hands to ruthless ones in a cycle of betrayal. In such chaos, nothing was more valuable than the certainty of lineage. To secure heirs was to secure stability. To marry daughters was to On the morning of her betrothal, she was dressed in finery beyond her years. Silks embroidered with gold thread weighed heavy on her fragile frame. Jewels were clasped around her neck, gifts from men she did not know. Her hair was braided into intricate coils, pinned with pearls to signify purity. To those who watched, she was radiant, a symbol of fortune and alliance. To herself, she was suffocating, a child swallowed whole by ceremony. There are accounts of such girls trembling at the altar, not from joy, but from terror. Their vows recited in voices barely above a whisper, their hands cold in the grip of husbands many years older. The church bells that tolled were not just announcing a marriage, they were tolling the death of childhood. This is where her story begins. Not in triumph, not in coronation, but in the brutal stripping away of innocence. She was 12 years old, 12 and she had no say in the matter. 12, and already she was bound by laws older than herself. But the cruel irony is this. From this very breaking would come her making. The halls that once imprisoned her would one day echo with her commands. The throne that seemed impossibly distant would one day bow beneath her bloodline. The girl forced into submission would one day be remembered as the mother of a dynasty, the queen who turned her suffering into survival, her silence into strategy, her wounds into weapons. The curtain has risen and the stage is set. What begins as tragedy will twist into transformation. But in this first act, do not look for a queen. Look at the trembling child beneath the veil, the girl who was sold into a life not of her choosing. Because before she wore a crown, she wore chains, and only by enduring those chains would she learn how to break them. Her dolls replaced with wedding jewels, her laughter silenced by whispers of politics, childhood ended before it could even begin. From the moment she could walk, she was watched. At first, it was only the gentle supervision of nurses, maids, and her mother's attendants. But as she grew, the eyes sharpened. Every movement, every word was weighed against the standards of noble womanhood. She was to be modest, pious, and graceful. She was to speak softly, never interrupt, and never forget that her future was not her own. Other children of 12 still ran barefoot in gardens, their hands sticky from stolen honeycombs, their knees scratched from climbing walls. But she was dressed in gowns heavy enough to crush a spirit, trained to bow before those who considered her worth not in innocence, but in the alliances she might secure. Childhood, in its purest sense, was not hers to keep. Imagine her small chamber on cold mornings, a carved wooden chair with her belongings, a crucifix on the wall, a window letting in the thin English light. On the table beside her bed, once there had been trinkets, bits of walls with painted faces, a little book of prayer aloud. Now those things had been in their place, embroidery hoops, erections in Latin phrases she did not understand. The message was clear. She was no longer a child. At meals she was placed, listening to their endless talk of husbands and spouses. When her eyes wandered towards the scullery boys laughing as they carried trays, their lives seemed freer than hers. She could not have known that her envy was of freedom to choose, to run, to live without the crushing. Even as her innocence away, her mind began the shadows that others ignored. She heard the way her voice lowered when envoyed. She noticed the tone of her mother when dowry asked. She felt the whispered words about her, useful, fertile, She did not yet understand their full meaning, but she understood enough. She was no longer a girl, she was a bargaining chip. One evening she overheard her parents speaking. The door was cracked and the firelight cast their figures in harsh silhouette. Her father spoke of lands, of debts, of alliances. Her mother's voice trembled with, "She is too young." The reply came cold. "She is of age in the ard. The match must be made." Those whirled on her like frost. Young. The phrase mind. She wanted to room, to cry out, to say not ready, but she knew, had been taught silence. The girl's virtue was not in act, but in obedience. She swallowed the fear and cursed that night, her small hand the blanket as though it kept her from the future pressing. The change came. Her dresses grew rich, meals more formal. Her demanded at gatherings where she understood the words being. Priests reminded her of duty. She was told that her parents was obedient. She was reminded that the Mary had been young too, bore a child. The lesson, mentors comfort, was instead a burden too heavy for her frail shoulder. The gravity was that the people around her saw this stripping away of childhood not as tragedy but as triumph. They spoke of her as fortunate, blessed, destined for greatness. Courtiers bowed as she passed, not because she was loved, but because their iron tongues shook the morning air, echoing across courtyards and cloisters. Each strike carried the weight of tradition, of obligation, of power dressed as holiness. And at the center of it all stood her, 12 years old, her body wrapped in silks too heavy for her shoulders. The gown shimmered with golden thread, but she could barely lift her feet beneath its weight. Her veil, pinned tight with pearls, blurred the world before her eyes. Through the gauze, the chapel seemed distant, unreal, like a dream turned nightmare. The scent of incense filled her nose, mingling with the wax of candles and the damp chill of stone walls. She clutched her rosary, though the beads slipped against her trembling fingers. Every step down that long aisle felt like a sentence passed. The groom waited at the altar, older, assured, his expression calm but unreadable. To him, this was triumph. To her, this was terror. He did not see a child. He saw an alliance. He saw the promise of heirs, of wealth, of land secured. She could feel the eyes of the court upon her, rows of nobles, bishops, and courtiers. Their faces were masks of satisfaction, each one seeing victory in her submission. She searched those faces for kindness, for pity, for rescue, but none came. Not a single person rose to say, "She is too young." Not a single voice broke the silence of approval. The priest began the words of binding. Ancient Latin phrases rolled through the air, words older than she was, older than her parents, older even than the stones of the chapel. Words meant to sanctify, words meant to bless. But to her they sounded like chains. Her lips moved as instructed, repeating vows she could not fully grasp. She spoke of fidelity, of obedience, of duty, though she did not know the depths of the promises she made. The groom placed the ring upon her finger. The cold metal slid down her hand, locking into place. Like a shackle, the congregation murmured approval. The union was sealed. There was no applause, no celebration of love, only nods of satisfaction as though a debt had been paid. The ceremony ended quickly, as such unions often did. Her hand was taken into his. His grip was firm, commanding, claiming. Her own was limp, reluctant, caught between fear and resignation. The bells rang again, not in joy but in ritual, announcing to the world that a child had become a bride. That innocence had been transformed into property. The chapel doors opened and sunlight poured in, striking her face. It should have been warm, it should have felt like blessing. Instead it burned. Because outside those doors she was no longer a daughter, she was no longer a girl, she was a wife, she was a possession. And as the crowd parted for her procession, whispers followed. Whispers of heirs, whispers of alliances, whispers of the power that now rested upon her womb. Inside she felt hollow. The child within her, the one who once dreamed of laughter, of freedom, of play, was fading. Each vow, each word spoken that day had buried her deeper. And yet, deep beneath the weight of despair, a spark flickered, a small, fragile awareness that she was watching, that she was remembering, that someday these chains might become lessons, someday silence might become strength. But for now she was 12, and she was married, and the world had decided her fate. The whispers began almost immediately. Every look cast toward her was no longer about her dress, her smile, or her obedience. It was about her womb. Would she quicken? Would she carry? Would she bring forth the child who might secure the dynasty? She was 13. 13, and the court already pressed its gaze upon her belly, as if it were a throne of flesh. The first mist cycle was greeted with hushed prayers of gratitude. Her body, still fragile, still narrow of hip, was already being forced into the role of a mother. She did not understand the depth of what was happening, only the aching sickness in the mornings, the sharp cramps that stole her breath, the way her dresses, stitched tighter each week, could no longer be fastened. Her attendants smiled, calling it a blessing, but she saw the fear in their eyes when they helped her into bed. They knew the risks. Girls her age often did not survive childbirth. The corridors of castles had echoed too many times with the screams of children dying to deliver children, but for the crown, her suffering was irrelevant. Her survival mattered only as long as it produced an heir. The months dragged on. Her back ached as though weighted with stones. Her ankles swelled, her hands trembled, her skin grew pale. The food she once enjoyed now made her ill. At night, she lay awake, pressing a hand to her stomach, feeling the small movements inside, a flutter, a kick. Life within her, though she herself still straddled the line between child and woman. She wanted to whisper to the child, to tell it of the games she once played, of the dreams she once had, but the words caught in her throat, because she knew this child was not hers alone. It belonged to the dynasty, to the court, to the relentless machine of power that had consumed her life. When the time came, the air in the chamber grew heavy. Torches burned low, casting flickering shadows across the stone walls. Midwives gathered with bowls of water and cloths. Priests muttered prayers outside the door, their words blending with the rising tension of the room. She was laid upon the bed, her small body trembling with terror. The first pain came like waves, tearing through her with merciless force. She cried out, clutching the sheets, her voice breaking against the cold stone. The midwives urged her on, their hands firm, their instructions relentless. But she was only 13, her bones not yet wide enough, her body not yet ready. Hours stretched into eternity. Screams tore from her throat, echoing down the corridors where courtiers waited with anxious faces. Some prayed for a boy, others whispered wages. None thought of the child who lay broken upon the bed. Blood stained the sheets, sweat poured down her brow. Her nails dug into the wood of the bed frame until they bled. Again and again they urged her, push, push. And in the final agony, when her strength seemed spent, a cry pierced the chamber, not hers. The cry of new life. The child had come. A boy. The news spread through the castle like wildfire. The court erupted with relief. Bells rang in celebration. Prayers rose in thanksgiving. The dynasty was secure. But no one asked about her. She lay pale, nearly unconscious, her body broken, her breath shallow. The midwives worked frantically to stop the bleeding, to cool her fevered skin, to keep her tethered to life. For days she drifted between waking and darkness. Her body shook with chills, her lips cracked with thirst, her cries muffled by weakness. And yet, when the child was placed in her arms, something shifted. She stared at the small face, at the delicate fingers curling against her own. A flicker of warmth broke through the haze of pain. Not joy, not peace. But something primal, something fierce. A mother's bond, born not of choice but of survival. She whispered his name, though her voice was hoarse. She swore to herself that if she had no power, no voice, no freedom, then she would live for him, for his survival, for his future, for the blood she had nearly died to give. But the cruelty of it lingered. She was a mother, but still a child. Her arms too thin to carry him long, her frame too weak to endure the strain of nursing. Yet expectations did not ease. The court demanded her presence, the king demanded her obedience, the people demanded she repeat the ordeal again and again until death or age silenced her womb. Every glance cast her way was no longer of pity, but of calculation. How soon until the next child? How long until she produces another heir? She realized, with a chill deeper than winter's breath, that her suffering was endless. Pregnancy was not a single trial, it was a cycle of pain, of risk, of fear. Her body was no longer her own, it was property of the crown. And yet somewhere within that cycle of torment, resolve began to take root. Every contraction, every cry, every drop of blood shed had left a mark. But not only on her body, on her soul. She understood now the price of power. She understood now the indifference of those who claimed to guide her. She understood that if she were to survive, she would have to change. No one would save her. No one would speak for her. If she was to endure, if her son was to rise, then she must learn the art of silence, the art of patience, the art of survival. 13 years old, and already she was a mother. Already she had tasted the agony of childbirth and the indifference of power. Already she had lost what little remained of innocence. The child she carried had been torn from her body in blood and pain, but the woman she would become was being bodesang, Oran in the same moment, not in joy, not in triumph, but in trauma, and that trauma would shape her into something the court could never foresee. The castle should have been sanctuary. Stone walls, towering gates, guards at every corner, but to her it was a cage. Every door opened only with permission. Every word spoken was carried by servants' tongues to ears that judged. Her world shrank to corridors of silence. She walked past tapestries of saints and battles, yet none reflected her truth. She was not a victor, she was not a saint. She was a prisoner. Her child was taken to a wet nurse, as was custom. She saw him only in glimpses. A moment in the nursery, a brief touch before attendants carried him away. The one life she had nearly died to bring into the world was already slipping from her grasp. Her arms ached with emptiness. Her heart hollowed with loss, but no protest could leave her lips. To question was to risk disgrace. To resist was to invite punishment. Her days blurred into ritual, prayers at dawn, embroidery by daylight, lessons in scripture and obedience. Evenings spent at court, her face painted with a mask of composure, but beneath the mask, despair whispered. She was watched by ladies-in-waiting who reported on her mood. She was shadowed by priests who judged her piety. Even in her chamber, she was never alone. Privacy was a dream she could not afford. The court celebrated her survival. They praised her as blessed, chosen, obedient. But behind their smiles lurked envy and malice. Rival women whispered about her youth. Older noblemen sneered at her weakness. Some even plotted her downfall, eager to see another replace her. She felt their eyes like daggers. Every step she took was weighed against invisible scales of worth. And yet, within this cage, something stirred. She began to watch, to listen, to learn. If she could not run, she could endure. If she could not speak, she could remember. If she could not fight, she could survive. The girl who once clung to dolls had been forced into chains of duty. Now she understood that power was not only the sword or the crown. Power could be silence. Power could be patience. Power could be survival itself. The cage around her was unyielding, but inside she was sharpening, not with steel, but with resolve. And though no one saw it yet, the child bride imprisoned behind stone walls was slowly becoming something far more dangerous. A survivor who would one day learn to rule the cage itself. To endure the cruelty, she learned the cruel, transforming fear into strategy, obedience into subtle defiance, weakness into whispered influence. Cruelty in the court was never loud. It was quiet, it was polished, it was hidden behind jeweled smiles and honeyed words, a glance too sharp, a laugh too long, a rumor released like venom into the air. She felt it daily, her youth mocked, her frailty scorned, her failures exaggerated until they echoed across the hall. One evening, a goblet of wine was handed to her. She hesitated. The room went still. Was it poisoned, or was the true poison the suspicion itself? She drank, and the courtiers smirked. They wanted her fear. They fed on it. But she learned. Every humiliation was a lesson. Every slight was a warning. Every cruelty was a map of the world she now inhabited. She discovered that the weak who survived did so by becoming watchful. She noticed which servants whispered to which nobles. She memorized who bowed deepest and who avoided her gaze. She began to collect secrets the way others collected jewels, not with malice, yet, but with the instinct of survival. There were nights when she cried in silence, the weight unbearable. Nights when she longed for her lost childhood, for freedom, for the comfort of a mother's arms. But with every tear she whispered to herself, endure. The cruelty was forging her, shaping her into so. Things steel hard, even her obedience became a mask. She nodded when spoken to, she prayed when told, she smiled when commanded. But beneath the surface, her mind was sharpening like a blade. She realized that cruelty was not only inflicted, it could be turned, it could be wielded, it could become power. And so she began to practice small acts of defiance hidden within obedience, a word spoken to the right ear, a silence held at the perfect moment, a gaze that lingered just long enough to unsettle. She learned the court's language, the language of survival. It was not Latin, it was not English, it was cruelty itself, cruelty as currency, cruelty as strategy. The girl who once trembled at whispers was learning to whisper back. She had entered the cage powerless, but the cage had become her classroom, and in its shadows she was no longer only enduring, she was transforming. For years she had been nothing more than a piece on the board, moved, traded and silenced at the will of others. But every board eventually shifts, and every pawn has the chance, however small, to advance. Her chance came not in triumph but in crisis. The kingdom trembled, factions grew restless, and whispers of betrayal spread like wildfire through the corridors of power. And in that chaos, she found her first opening. She had learned to listen. More importantly, she had learned when not to speak. It was in silence that she discovered the truth, that men who thought themselves untouchable could be divided, manipulated, and outplayed. Where once she would have cowered, now she watched. Where once she would have bowed, now she calculated. For the first time, she saw the court not as a prison but as a battlefield, and if survival meant war, she was ready. The change was subtle at first, a carefully chosen word at a feast offered with apparent innocence but designed to tilt suspicion toward a rival, a gift presented at the perfect moment ensuring loyalty from a wavering ally. She did not confront power directly, She could not, but she began to weave herself into the very fabric of its movements, unseen yet indispensable. In her stillness, she became dangerous. The courtiers noticed. The same nobles who once sneered at her youth now began to glance twice before underestimating her. The servants who once pitied her now leaned closer to hear her soft-spoken commands. Even her husband, long indifferent, grew wary of her quiet strength. For in her composure there was now an edge, an authority born not of crown or bloodline, but of survival hardened into resolve. But power is never won without risk. Every step she took on the board could have cost her everything. A single exposed secret could have condemned her to exile, disgrace, or death. Yet she pressed forward. She understood at last that living as a pawn was no life at all. If she was to remain in the game, she would not remain a victim. She would become a player. And in this shift, something irreversible happened within her. The broken girl, married at 12 and stripped of innocence at 13, no longer defined herself by suffering alone. The cruelty she endured had carved into her a new shape, sharper and more dangerous than those who sought to destroy her could imagine. She was no longer the child locked in the royal cage. She was the strategist watching the board, waiting for her moment to strike. That moment had not yet come, but it was close. The game had only just begun, and the pawn had started her march toward the crown. The board on which she played her silent game soon darkened with shadows larger than her own struggles. For years she had endured cruelty, in private chambers, but now the kingdom itself staggered under the weight of betrayal and bloodshed. Rebellion stirred at the edges of the realm, plots coiled within the palace walls, and rumors of treachery seeped through the court like smoke from a hidden fire. It was no longer whispers of insult she faced, but whispers of death. And in this crucible, she discovered what it truly meant to bear the crown's trials. A plague of mistrust consumed the nobility. Brothers turned against brothers, allies transformed into enemies, and even the most trusted advisors proved false. At any moment, a hand extended in friendship could become the very hand that delivered poison. The girl who had once trembled at such fears now moved among them with unnerving calm. She had suffered too much already to flinch at danger. Fear, after all, had already burned through her veins 100 times. What remained was not terror but cold focus. Her darkest trial came when her loyalty was questioned. Some whispered that she was too young to command respect, too broken to inspire loyalty, too insignificant to hold any real sway. Enemies twisted her past against her, reminding the court of her forced marriage, her early motherhood, her humiliations. They painted her as a fragile puppet, unfit for survival in a world of steel and fire, and for a moment she teetered on the edge of ruin. But here, in the heart of her trial, she revealed her transformation. Where once she would have defended herself with tears or silence, now she wielded memory as a weapon. She reminded her accusers, subtly, with calculated grace, that she had endured what no nobleman could bear. She had bled for the realm, nearly died to deliver its future, and risen from despair unbroken. Her suffering became her shield, her survival her proof of legitimacy. Still, the cruelty of the trial was relentless. Rumors persisted, daggers gleamed in the dark, and each morning she awoke uncertain if she would live to see the night. Yet this constant threat honed her sharper still. The child bride who once cowered in silence had become a woman who could walk into a hall of enemies and meet every gaze without lowering her eyes. And in surviving this darkest trial, she gained something even more dangerous than protection. She gained respect, not love, not trust, but a grudging acknowledgement from those who sought to undo her. They could not break her, they could not silence her, and so they feared her. The darkest trial of the crown had not destroyed her, it had revealed her. From the shadows of betrayal and the stench of blood, she stepped forward not as a victim of circumstance, but as a figure shaped by suffering, wielding resilience as her blade. The kingdom would never forget this moment, and neither would she. Power is never gentle, it is forged in cruelty, sustained by fear, and remembered through the scars it leaves behind. For her, the crown became both a weapon and a wound. By surviving humiliation, betrayal, and endless suspicion, she had climbed higher than any expected. She was no longer merely the child married at 12, nor the fragile mother at 13. She had become a queen in truth, and with that transformation came a legacy stained with both triumph and blood. Those who once sought to crush her now bent their heads in reluctant obedience. They spoke her name in council, not with affection but with recognition. She had proven herself not by kindness but by endurance. The cruelty she suffered had become the very foundation of her strength, yet in wielding that strength she sometimes echoed the harshness that had shaped her. Power, she learned, demanded sacrifice, and often it demanded cruelty in return. Her legacy began to ripple outward. Younger girls, trapped in the same cycle of forced marriages and silent obedience, whispered her story as both warning and inspiration. To some, she was proof that survival could lead to power. To others, she was evidence that innocence, once taken, could never be restored. Mothers prayed their daughters might be spared her path, yet they also pointed to her as a symbol that even broken beginnings could lead to unimaginable influence. But history does not paint legacies in soft colors. It remembers victories, betrayals, and the shadows between them, and so her name became tied to both compassion and cruelty. Some praised her resilience, her unshakable will, her ability to outlast the men who underestimated her. Others accused her of becoming what she once despised, calculating, merciless, and willing to let others suffer so long as her throne remained secure. Both views held truth. Both views revealed the paradox of survival. In the stillness of night, she sometimes wondered if the girl she once was still lived within her. The girl who clutched a doll, who dreamed of freedom, who wept at the loss of her child's arms. Or had that girl been consumed entirely, replaced by the queen who now wielded silence and strategy as weapons? The line between victim and ruler blurred until she could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. Her legacy then was not of purity or of corruption alone. It was of transformation, the raw, brutal metamorphosis of a girl stripped of choice who became a woman who bent choice itself to her will. The kingdom remembered her not as the broken child, but as the queen who endured. And in that endurance, her name etched itself into history's cruel pages, a reminder that power born of suffering can never escape the shadow of cruelty. History remembers her with awe, but memory is a cruel mirror, for behind the titles, the triumphs, and the jeweled crown lies the image of a girl who never chose her path. Married at 12, pregnant at 13, broken before she was grown. Her survival was extraordinary, her rise to power undeniable, but her story lingers not as a tale of glory alone. It lingers as a haunting reminder of what suffering forges in silence. When we speak of queens, we speak of power. We imagine strength carved in stone, voices that command armies, hands that shape kingdoms. But for her, power was first a chain. It was endurance through nights of tears. It was the quiet swallowing of humiliation. It was the resilience to live when death might have been kinder. Before she ever ruled others, she ruled her own despair. That was her first throne and the hardest one to keep. Her reign carved scars not only upon herself, but upon those who lived beneath her shadow. The people saw in her a woman both merciful and merciless, a figure who could comfort with one hand and destroy with the other. Was she cruel because cruelty had shaped her, or was she simply doing what survival demanded? The answer remains blurred, caught between history's judgment and the unknowable truth of her heart. Yet even in the cruelty of her legacy there lies a deeper truth. She never forgot what it meant to suffer. In every whisper of manipulation, in every silent calculation, she carried the weight of her lost innocence. Perhaps that was her greatest weapon, not power alone, but the memory of powerlessness. She understood human suffering because she had lived it, and in her own way, she made the cage her throne. Centuries later, her story is retold not as a fairy tale, but as a caution. A reminder that behind the glittering crowns of history often lie shattered childhoods, stolen freedoms, and silent tears. She was both victim and ruler, pawn and queen, scarred child and iron sovereign. And perhaps that duality is what makes her memory so haunting, because it forces us to ask, what would we become if forged in the same fire? The girl who once wept behind locked doors now lingers in history as England's most powerful queen. But listen closely to the silence between the lines of her story, and you will hear her echo. Not a cry of triumph, not even a cry of despair, but the whisper of endurance itself. A whisper that reminds us power is born in cruelty, resilience in trauma, and history in the survival of those who refuse to break. Her crown gleamed, her name endured, but her story will forever walk the line between inspiration and warning, between survival and sacrifice, between the child she was and the queen she became, and that is her haunting truth.